When you grow old, if your children don't respect or ignore you, stay calm and do this. Have you ever sat silently in your room, staring at your phone, waiting for a message, a call from your children, but nothing ever comes? You remember the days when your child would run to you, hug you tightly, and call you their hero, their whole world. But now, all that remains is silence, calls that go unanswered, messages that have been read but never replied to. That emptiness is overwhelming. It feels like an old oak tree that once shielded many from the rain and wind. But as its roots grew deep and its leaves aged, people gradually left it behind, abandoning it to stand alone in an empty field. You once believed that your sacrifices would be remembered, that in old age, you would be cherished and respected. But reality is not always what we imagine. Over time, you realize that family bonds are not always unbreakable, and the sacrifices you made are not always met with gratitude. You cannot beg for attention. You must create value to be respected. A vintage clock, when first purchased, is placed in the most prominent spot, admired by everyone. But as time passes, it gets pushed into a corner, gathering dust. Yet does that clock lose its value? No, its worth remains, it just needs to be polished and placed back where it belongs. And so do you. This is not the time for complaints or resentment. This is the time to stand up, make a change, and reclaim your own worth. On this journey, I will share with you the 8 most important lessons of old age, lessons that help me turn pain into strength, indifference into motivation, and find happiness and self-respect once again. But first, there is one crucial thing I need you to understand. Anger will not earn you the respect of your children. In fact, it may push them even further away. Lesson 1: Don't react with anger. I once sat silently in my room, staring at my phone, waiting for a call from my son. But the screen remained silent. I tried calling first, the phone rang for a long time, but no one answered. The first time, I thought he was busy. The second time, I told myself maybe he forgot. But by the third and fourth times, I realized that the feeling of being forgotten was real. Anger started to rise within me. I wanted to call back immediately, to ask him outright why he was treating me this way. I had sacrificed my entire life to raise him, and now, even a simple phone call had become too much to ask. But just as I was about to press the call button, I stopped. I took a deep breath and looked out the window. Would this anger make me feel any better? Would it bring my son closer to me, or only push him further away? I thought back to years ago when I, too, was busy with work. How many times had my son tugged at my shirt, asking me to play with him, only for me to respond, "Later, son." And did that "later" ever come? For the first time, I understood that the distance between parents and children is not just caused by one side. That day, I decided not to call back in frustration. I didn't send a resentful message or demand his attention. Instead, I stepped outside, took a walk in the park, breathed in the fresh air, and let my anger slowly fade away. When I got home, I wrote a letter. Not a letter filled with blame, but a heartfelt message. I shared stories with my son about the times I had unintentionally let him down when he was young, and how I had come to learn that love and connection cannot be forced, they must be nurtured by both sides. 3 days later, my phone rang. My son was calling. His voice carried a hint of guilt. He said he had been too busy lately, that he never meant to ignore me, and that he wanted to visit this weekend. I smiled. Not because he finally called, but because I had not let my anger take control. The more fiercely we react, the more our children drift away. When I remained calm, I not only preserved my own dignity but also created the space for us to mend what had been lost. From that moment, I learned that while I cannot control how my children treat me, I can control how I respond. I can choose resentment, or I can choose peace. And I chose peace. If you, too, feel abandoned, if you are disappointed by your child's indifference, ask yourself, will anger restore respect, or will it only push them further away? I chose to remain calm. And I invite you to do the same. But staying calm is not enough. How do we make our children genuinely want to reconnect with us, not out of obligation, but because they truly want to? I found the answer, and in the next lesson, I will share it with you. Don't miss it. It could change the way you communicate with your children forever. Lesson 2, Rebuilding Your Own Life. I once thought that when my children grew up, would still be an important part of their lives. I believed that no matter how busy they became, they would always make time for me, that they would still need me just like they did before. But reality was not what I had imagined. There were days when I sat by the window, looking out at the road in front of my house, hoping for a message, a phone call. But all I got was silence. I asked myself, what did I do wrong? Am I no longer important to them? But then I realized that I had placed my happiness in someone else's hands, and that was a mistake. One morning, I woke up and decided not to wait anymore. I stepped into my garden, quietly took out old seeds from my drawer, and planted them. At first, it was just a few small pots, but I realized that when I created something, I felt more meaningful. I continued doing the things I had once loved but had long neglected. I joined a book club, met new friends, and started writing my own stories again. Little by little, I no longer felt like someone just waiting to be remembered. I found joy in simple things. I started living a life where I was at the center, not revolving around anyone else. Then one day, my son called. He noticed that I had changed. He no longer heard the voice of a father who was longing for attention, but instead, a father who was truly enjoying his life. He asked me what I had been up to, and for the first time in years, I felt a genuine curiosity from my own child. At that moment, I understood something important. When I stopped living as a shadow in my child's life, I began to shine in my own. And when I had my own light, people naturally gravitated toward me. You cannot force someone to love you. But you can make yourself memorable and worthy of respect. And that only happens when you start living for yourself. In the next lesson, I will share how I made my children truly respect me, not out of responsibility or obligation, but because I deserve it. Lesson 3, Communicate wisely to reconnect with your children. For a long time, I felt the distance between my son and me growing wider. When he was little, I was the center of his world, but as he grew older, I seemed to become just a small part of his busy life. Our phone calls became shorter and shorter. Every time I called, he would respond quickly, "Dad, I'm busy. I'll call you later." But that later never seemed to come. At first, I was disappointed. Then, I became angry. I wanted to send him a message, to ask outright how he could be so indifferent. But just as I was about to press send, I stopped. I asked myself, would a message full of reproach make my son want to call me more? Or would it only push him further away? I thought about times when I had been criticized. When someone complained about me, did I feel like staying close to them? The answer was no. So why was I expecting my son to react any differently? That day, I decided to try a different approach. I found an old photo of my son, the one where he was smiling brightly while I carried him on my back. I sent him a simple message: "I just found this old picture of you. You looked so happy back then. Whenever you have time, I'd love to show it to you." Just a few minutes later, he replied, "Dad, send it to me." For the first time in a long while, he took the initiative to connect. A few days later, he called to check in, and slowly, our relationship began to change. Our calls were no longer brief exchanges out of obligation but turned into real conversations. I realized that blame cannot create connection, only understanding can bring two people closer. If I wanted my child to care, I had to build a natural connection, rather than demanding or resenting him for his absence. I stopped asking my son why he wasn't calling. Instead, I focused on making every conversation meaningful. And I noticed that as I changed the way I communicated, my son also changed the way he responded to me. But no matter how strong our bond became, one thing remained crucial: maintaining respect by setting healthy boundaries. That is what I will share in the next lesson. Lesson 4, Set healthy boundaries to maintain respect. For a long time, I was always available for my children. Whenever they needed help, I was there immediately. When they were busy, I took care of my grandchildren so they could focus on work. When they had financial difficulties, I didn't hesitate to support them. I thought this was the way to keep them close, to remind them that I was still important. But then, I realized a painful truth: they only reached out when they needed something, and when they didn't, it was as if I didn't exist in their lives. I started feeling more like I was being used than being appreciated. The calls were only for favors, the visits were only when there was something they needed help with. One day, I realized I had canceled too many of my own plans to meet their demands, while they had never once asked if I was busy. For the first time, I decided to say no. When my son called at the last minute asking me to babysit, I gently but firmly replied, "I love my grandchild very much, but I already have plans today. If you need my help next time, please let me know in advance so I can arrange my schedule." He was silent for a moment, seemingly a little uncomfortable, but then he agreed. And something unexpected happened. The next time he needed help, he asked if I was available first. Over time, the calls were no longer just about favors but also to genuinely check in on me. I understood then that I couldn't demand respect, I had to teach others how to respect me. If I didn't value my own time and life, my children wouldn't either. I never stopped loving my children, but I learned how to set boundaries. And because of that, my son respected me more. In the next lesson, I will share how I became someone my children truly admired, not someone they simply felt obligated to care for. Lesson 5. Become someone your children admire, not someone they pity. I used to think that if my children knew I was lonely, they would spend more time with me. So every time they called, I would complain, "I feel so lonely, I have no one to talk to," or, "You're all so busy, I don't know what to do with myself." I believed this would make them care about me more, but the reality was the opposite. The phone calls became shorter, the visits less frequent. I didn't feel more connected, I only felt the growing distance between us. Then one day, I stopped and asked myself, am I making my children want to be around me, or am I pushing them further away? I realized that no one wants to return to a place filled with complaints and sadness. My children didn't want to feel guilty every time they called. If every conversation was weighed down by negativity, why would they want to reach out? I didn't need my children's pity, I needed their admiration. From that day on, I decided to change. Instead of waiting for a call, I went out to find my own joy. I joined a photography club, learned how to paint, and tried things I had never had time for before. A few weeks later, my son called and heard music in the background. Surprised, he asked, "Dad, where are you?" I smiled and replied, "I'm at an art exhibition. I have my first showcase this weekend." For the first time in a long while, he wanted to see me, not out of obligation, but out of curiosity. From that moment on, our conversations were no longer just a duty. He started calling more often, asking about my new projects, wanting to know what I had been up to. I learned that if I wanted my children to remember me, I had to become someone they admired, not someone they felt guilty for neglecting. When I lived with passion and purpose, I no longer had to demand attention. They naturally came to me. In the next lesson, I will share how I maintained financial independence, because respect always comes with self-sufficiency. Lesson 6. Maintain financial independence to keep your dignity. I used to think that when I grew old, my children would be my strongest support. I had sacrificed my entire youth to raise them, so when the time came that I needed help, wouldn't they be ready to support me? At first, everything went as I had expected. When I needed money to renovate my house or cover big expenses, my son was always happy to help. But over time, I began to notice a change. His responses were no longer as enthusiastic as before. Every time I asked, he hesitated and said he would transfer the money later. One day, I accidentally overheard a conversation between my son and his wife. His voice was filled with guilt, but there was also a hint of pressure. "I know Dad needs money, but we have a lot of expenses this month too. I love him, but sometimes I feel really stuck." I was stunned to realize that I had unintentionally become a burden. I never wanted my children to help me out of obligation, nor did I want them to feel trapped between their duty to their parents and their own lives. That day, I decided to change. I looked at what I had and asked myself, can I take care of myself without depending on my children? I started making use of what I was good at. I tutored a few students in the neighborhood, sold handmade crafts that I used to make in my spare time. I educated myself about financial management, began saving, and created a clear financial plan. Bit by bit, I regained control over my life. One day, my son called and asked, "Dad, do you need me to send you more money?" I smiled and replied, "No, son. I've got it handled." In fact, today I treated myself to a nice meal. For the first time, I heard a relieved laugh instead of a deep sigh. I realized that when you can take care of yourself, your children will love you sincerely, not out of obligation. Having financial stability not only gave me freedom but also ensured that my children continued to respect me. Most importantly, it allowed me to maintain my own dignity. In the next lesson, I will share the most important lesson I learned: how to forgive, but never forget your own worth. Lesson 7. Learn to forgive, but never forget your own worth. I once thought that as I grew older, my children would always be there for me, giving me the same attention I once gave them. But then I realized that their busy lives gradually turned into distance, and I found myself forgotten in my own world. The phone calls became infrequent, the promises of "I'll come visit" rarely became reality. I couldn't even remember the last time my son had reached out to me first. At first, I tried to accept it, but over time, sadness turned into pain. There were nights when I sat alone, thinking about everything I had done over the years. I had sacrificed everything, and now, all I was left with was silence. I felt as though I no longer mattered to my child. I thought about calling to confront him. I wanted to tell him how much he was hurting me, how lonely I felt. But then, I stopped. I asked myself, if I do this, what will change? Will my son want to come back, or will he distance himself even more? I realized that resentment wouldn't make my child love me more, it would only bring me more pain. That day, I decided to do something for myself. I found an old journal where I had once recorded life's little joys. I started writing again. I went out more, joined an art club, and tried things I had once forgotten because I had dedicated all my time to my family. A few months later, my son happened to see a small newspaper article about me, about an elderly man rediscovering his passion. That same evening, he called. For the first time in a long while, he asked about my life with genuine curiosity, not just out of obligation. That was when I understood. When I stopped blaming and started living for myself, my son no longer came to me out of duty, but out of admiration. Forgiveness does not mean letting others take you for granted. Forgiveness is how you free yourself from pain and continue living with the worth you deserve. In the next lesson, I will share how I built a new circle of connections, so I no longer had to rely on my child's affection for happiness. Lesson: building a new circle of connections so you no longer depend on your children's affection. I once believed that as I grew older, my children would always be my greatest source of joy. I had spent my entire life raising, protecting, and loving them. I sacrificed, gave them my time, my energy, and my devotion. I thought that no matter how busy life got, they would always make time for me. But then, I came to a harsh realization: if I relied solely on my children for happiness, I would always live in disappointment. I remember the day my son left home to start his own life. I stood at the door, watching his figure fade into the distance, my heart filled with immense pride yet overwhelming emptiness. I reassured myself, it's okay, he'll call, he'll come visit. But as time passed, the calls became less frequent, and the visits even rarer. At first, I tried to convince myself that he was just busy, that life had its demands. But then, the weeks turned into months. There were days when I sat by the window, staring at the road outside, hoping for a message, a phone call, but nothing ever came. I started asking myself, am I living just to wait? Was my existence now just about sitting idly, longing for a call that might never come? Was my worth tied only to whether my children remembered me? I realized I didn't want to spend the remaining years of my life in loneliness and anticipation. I wanted to live. That day, I made a decision. I would no longer wait, I would create. I stepped out of the house and went to a cafe in my neighborhood where a group of middle-aged men often gathered in the morning. I listened to their conversations about life, about the little joys they found each day. They talked about books they read, hobbies they enjoyed, and their small victories in life. Their conversations intrigued me, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a spark of curiosity. A week later, I joined a golf class, even though I had never held a club before. I met new people, others who had also faced loneliness but had turned it into motivation to enjoy life instead of dwelling in sadness. Slowly but surely, I began to feel the difference. I no longer felt like I needed my son to be happy. I had new friends, meaningful conversations, and afternoons filled with laughter. I had something to look forward to each day that didn't depend on my children's attention. Then, something interesting happened. One day, when my son called, I didn't rush to pick up the phone as I used to. I was busy enjoying a round of golf with my friends. "Dad, you seem really busy these days," he laughed. "That's right, son. I'm living an exciting life." For the first time in years, I no longer felt alone. I had redefined my happiness. I had created a life that was fulfilling on its own, one that didn't require validation from anyone else. And as I did, something else changed, my son's perception of me. I realized that my happiness should not be solely dependent on my children. By expanding my own circle, I not only felt less lonely, but my son also began to look at me with admiration rather than obligation. Final chapter: happiness is what you create for yourself. For years, I waited, waiting for a phone call, waiting for attention, waiting for validation. I thought that if I waited long enough, my children would naturally reach out more, that they would feel a sense of duty to check in on me. But the truth is, the more I waited, the more disappointed I became. I had placed my happiness in someone else's hands, only to realize that no one else could give me fulfillment except myself. So, I stopped waiting. I started living life on my terms. I found joy in small things, in hobbies I had forgotten, in people I had yet to meet. I started pursuing what made me happy, not what made me feel validated. And then, something unexpected happened. When I stopped expecting attention from others, my children started reaching out to me more. They weren't calling out of guilt or obligation. They were calling because they were genuinely curious about my life. That was when I understood something powerful. Happiness does not come from the outside. It is created from within. When I changed, my life changed. When I started living each day to the fullest, I not only felt content, but I also made others appreciate my presence more. And so can you. Your happiness is in your hands. Start today, not for anyone else, but for yourself. If these lessons have resonated with you, hit the subscribe button so you won't miss more content that will help you live a happy, strong, and fulfilling life. Let's make a change together.